Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Our topic of discussion will be how to manage change in complex systems. And I'm thrilled to have two of the absolute industry thought leaders in this space, Al Shalloway and Steve Tendon. Al, welcome back. And if you want to give just a little bit of an intro on yourself, and then we'll move on to Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So I'm now with the PMI. I'm kind of the director of thought leadership for Agile at Scale programs there. I'm taking the work I had done and my team had done. Actually, it's just more them than me in a lot of ways of what we had done at Net Objectives, doing Agile at Scale and combining it into a cohesive program we call Flex, Flow for Enterprise Transformation. And complexity and how you deal with change is a key part of it. So this is a great forum to be discussing, not Flex, but the complexity part.
Fantastic. And Steve?
Well, Joshua, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this event. Really appreciate that. I've seen some of the previous episodes and they were all very, very interesting. What can I say about myself? Well, in the previous millennium, I started my career as a software engineer. So that is obviously the stone age of this field. And I started off in a legendary company, which was Borland, the makers of Turbo Pascal, Delphi, and so on and so forth. This was in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was in that period, just to connect a few dots on how I got here, that Jim Coplin studied software companies and realized that Borland was very, very special. He started documenting this in terms of patterns, organizational patterns. And in particular, his paper inspired like Jeff Sutherland to introduce like the stand-up meeting, the product owner and the Scrum Master role. So I feel like I have some common heritage with the origin of Scrum. Anyway, I went my own way. And long story short, eventually I became a management consultant and I developed these ideas based on patterns and arrived at defining, my own method, which I named TameFlow, and which is fundamentally based on patterns, but brings in a lot of lean, a lot of Kanban, a lot, and especially a lot of TOC. When I discovered Kanban, I liked it a lot, but I think it missed the capability of reasoning in terms of constraints and constraints management. So since 2005, 2006, that has been one of my major areas of research. And I think I've cracked that nut. How can you reason in terms of constraints management even in knowledge work, where we have VUCA and especially the topic of this call, lots of complexity. So that's how I got here.
Well, yeah, welcome. So I guess let's get the conversation started off with, if you guys both want to take a turn at talking about just the problem of inherent complexity.
Well, I'll start. So there are a couple of problems, actually, and I'm not even sure which one's worse. One problem is it's complex, meaning that there are things you can't understand, there are relationships you don't see, you can't get a totally predictive model of things. And that's the problem people talk about. But the bigger problem, in my mind, is what I would call the discussion of apparent complexity. In other words, a lot of what looks complex actually is just apparently complex because we don't see things. And this has led us in many ways to give up the opportunity to ask, are there better ways to deal with complexity than saying we can't predict it? And I think it's a reflection of Ford's famous statement, whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. And I think in a lot of ways, the conversation about whether we're complex or not avoids the question of what we're really trying to do is how do we work in complex systems, not so much how do we understand complex systems. Steve?
Yes, I think that's a very good framing. You know, the difference between inherent complexity, the complexity that is there in the world, and we cannot escape the fact, and apparent complexity. Where does this appearance derive from? Well, primarily from our way of looking at things. I like to refer to mental models, or our frames, perspectives, spectacles, which many times might distort reality beyond the point of having a useful understanding of what is going on. And what is worse is that if we live in this apparent complexity, which is self-inflicted complexity, then we might not be able to perform like the analysis of the situation and arrive at workable, actionable solutions. We just conclude, oh, it's complex, and shrug your shoulders and get on with it, rather than trying to figure out what can actually be done. So that is a very important first distinction. What is really complex, and what is the stuff that we are self-inflicting upon ourselves?
So what are some of the ways then that in organizations we can deal with the complexities that we're faced with? Oftentimes, and Al, I think I've heard you, talk about this many times, right? As far as running experiments, and it's not always just running experiments after experiments after experiments. So what are some of the things that you recommend as a starting point to start, unraveling a bit of this complexity?
Well, for me, it's understanding what a system is in the first place. And there's an excellent short video you can find. What if Russ Akoff gave a TED Talk? And he talks about, yeah, you're smiling because I refer to it all the time.
It's just super interesting. I mean, watching him from that time period.
It's just unreal. And he just nails it in so simple. The Fifth Discipline is brilliant by Senge, but it's a tough book to get through. And then in 10 minutes, and I highly recommend Senge's work. But basically, systems are not about the components as much as the relationships between the components. You take the best parts of the best cars, put them together, you got a pile of junk. It's how does an engine relate to the transmission and things like that. And in complex systems, what you have is a lot of things you can't see. So the first thing to understand is what we're up against, that there is this stuff out there. There is complexity. There are relationships we don't see, but there are also a lot of relationships we do see. And what we have to recognize is that embedded in complex systems are very mechanistic systems that you can make predictions off of. But I've been just recently talking about an asymmetry of this. For example, if you overload people with work and they have lots and lots, way more stuff than they can do, and they weren't overloaded before, then that's going to go bad. It's a bad thing. But if you look at a system where people are working on too many things, well, there could be several factors going on. So if you remove one, it doesn't mean you'll see improvement. So this asymmetry, when you look at how can things go worse, is often a key to identify one thing by itself. But one thing by itself can make things worse. One thing by itself will not make things better. So we have to recognize that aspect. And we have to start seeing that some of this complexity we have, as Steve says, is self-inflicted. We get results that look like inherent, but are really because many things are going on. So this idea of teasing things out. When you talk about experiments, or when I talk about experiments, I like to think of them as two different kinds. There are things I've tried that had never been done before. Over the last 20 years, I've got a half a dozen things that I remember one time I called it dynamic feature teams, where we did something that broke virtually every rule of Agile, but was consistent with Lean. And I knew it was going to work, but we had never done it before. That was a real experiment. We hadn't done it before, validated it, and it turned out to be brilliant. But then there are times that, well, I've done something several times, but every situation is unique. And then it's still an experiment. But it's now an experiment validating past experience, and you expect it to work. So when people use experiments, I think it's important to recognize we always need feedback, but it's an experiment in a true sense. We're not sure what's going to happen because it's never happened. We're just following our theory. Or it's an experiment, well, we always need validation. So that second one, I don't quite consider a natural experiment. It's just, you know, redoing something that's been done and just being careful.
Yeah, very interesting start there with citing Akoff and the reflection that complexity and systems arise not only from the components of the system, but primarily between the interrelationships between all these elements. And this, well, makes me think of, well, a number of things. But if you want to relate this to Goldratt, and I know I'll get into one of the topics that that Al will loves, is if you have everything connected to everything else, it's obvious that if you pull one element, you know, all the strings attached to everything else will make them move as well, and everything is interconnected. So you have less degrees of freedom in a complex system, and therefore that's where you get the leverage of trying to figure out of all the possible buttons that I can press, which is the one single button that has the most effect, the most bang for the buck. Well, it is the constraint in Goldratt's constraints management theory of constraints. But given that we have this situation, it means that even in a very complex system, if you're able to find that single point, you can have an enormous impact. And now I can relate this to practical experience, one of my key cases, where we had like 8,000 people, 4,000 engineers spread globally, with 70,000 change requests per month. And this organization was just so overburdened. By applying these principles of trying to find where is the bottleneck, the constraint, the limiting factor, we arrived at identifying one single team of 25 people. That single team was keeping everyone else behind. But unless you have this lens of wanting to find that team, you would just see complexity, interdependencies everywhere, and no apparent order to this madness. So that lens of being able to zoom into the leverage points is extremely powerful. And if I then go back to what was there before, when everything looked like total chaos, well, it is representative of what most knowledge work software engineering organizations perceive to be the reality, especially if they are growing organizations where they go beyond the single team or 2 or 3 teams, and they start to have 20, 100, hundreds of teams. And this is where I try to give us, mentioning Senge, so, you know, mental models, I try to simplify the understanding of these situations with my metaphor of the Jeep, the jungle, and the journey. So what is the Jeep? It's your team. It's your tool that brings you through this adventure. It has a process, engine, gears, and so on, as I'll mentioned before, and it will have a constraint. Maybe the engine is not powerful enough, but this Jeep moves through a jungle. You have like a map, a road map, if you want, and there you can foresee that maybe, oh, there is a mountain. So of course we'll go slower there. There is a workload coming against us, and we can foresee that is going to impact our performance. But then as we go along in the journey, Murphy comes along, stuff happens, the chaotic events, as Al likes to say, and maybe your engine breaks down. So you have a totally different element to contend with. And when you are in an organization, it is as if you have not one Jeep, but every team is a Jeep. So maybe you have hundreds of Jeeps going through this terrain, maybe through different paths. But if you have like this simplifying metaphor, you can possibly zoom into the terrain. Where is it most challenging? And there, which is the Jeep that is going slower? And if one Jeep breaks down, the classical accident, well, do we have the capacity to intervene? So simple metaphors can like give you a simplifying perspective, and what's appear to be very complex, you can relate to an everyday experience, like going on a stroll on a Jeep. So that's how you make it simpler.
Yeah.
I'd like to build on what Steve just said, because he talked about like finding one thing, and in his case, he did find one thing. And I don't think he means you always find one thing. And organizations are different. You're going to find different things. But one of the things Dr. Goldratt brought forth is this notion of inherent simplicity, which is how can you look in the organization and find a certain number of ways to look at it. This is not one set that works everywhere. It's always domain specific. But in the arena of knowledge work, I would say I've identified about 8 that are what I'd call candidates. In other words, in any organization, not all 8 will be in effect. And although usually a few are, but it gives you a way to look into the problem. I think this is the real key with complexity, is you understand that you really can't tell if it's inherent or something we've added, but maybe there's a way to look and learn. And one of the things, there are 3 things I think with Dr. Goldratt that really had an influence on me. They were things I was kind of like 90% there, but asymptotically getting to it. I don't think I would have ever gotten there until I read the choice. Every month and year I was getting closer, but, and the 3 things were kind of like, things work in harmony. And you'll see this, that when you fix one of these things that helps solve the problem, it actually gains advantage of the other things. As Steve said, pulling one thing, they're not really in conflict with each other. An example in knowledge work is smaller things. Working on smaller things help reduce delays. Mm-hmm. Also, doing smaller things help us focus on what's the most important thing. Because if you're not going in the right direction, it doesn't matter how efficient you are, except maybe to tell you you're going in the wrong direction. But so smaller things, reducing delays, higher value, these things tend to work together. So that's one important thing. The other important thing is that you're saying it's not a failure to not get the result. We're not focusing on a result. We're focusing on learning. So if you try something, if we think about all these relationships, some we see, some we don't see, some we see, we don't understand. Then if you try something like an experiment, say, or I'm sure this is going to work, even if I've got that attitude, and I validate it because actually this has happened to me. I'm sure this is going to work. And then it didn't. But what happened is I looked to see why didn't it? What was missing? What had I not seen before? I remember I had one of the worst consulting on my part engagements, and it would have been easy to blame myself. In fact, I did for a long time, but I was like the 8th client who bounced off this place. But it's still like, what are they not getting? So what happened is I learned a lot. I learned that something to look at that I hadn't been looking at before. So when you take the attitude, I'm going to get an improvement, I'm going to learn a new relationship, I'm going to learn something about an existing relationship I saw. Your attitude about complexity is not, am I going to get the change I want? But am I either going to get the change or prepare for it the next time around? And I think that's a different attitude than just being overwhelmed with what's happening. And I think that's, to me, the ultimate lesson of looking at complexity from what's the best way to view it so I can take effective action, as opposed to trying to understand complexity in and of itself.
Yeah, right. There I think one very important dimension of this self-inflicted complexity, as I mentioned before, is the fact that companies, organizations, they are social technical systems, and I would like to put the weight on the social aspects. Unfortunately, most organizations are inherently structured to promote, let's say, conflicts, friction, contrasts. So even if some part of the organization might be open to, let's say, experimentation, validated learning, trying things out, reasoning, root cause analysis, and so on and so forth, if other parts of the organization do not have an interest in that, well, they might be willfully blind to actual factual results. And therefore, doesn't matter if you are getting better in that part of the organization, if the rest is not following along, because maybe they have different KPIs and there are latent conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest are a huge source of apparent self-inflicted complexity. And of course, if you are in that situation, you will be distracted by the conflicts, and they will persist. So you will not be able to actually find the real root cause of why it appears to be so complex to resolve issues. So that's where I work a lot with starting with mental models, but also with this notion that I have of enlightened self-interest, where we want people at all levels in the organization to understand that through these lenses, where they are looking at things maybe differently, they can see that there is a self-interest. If you get to that point and you create more like alignment, then complex or apparently complex problems can be addressed in a completely different manner. Not that the problem changes, it's the perspective on the problem that changes. So working on the perspective that people have of problems is a key element.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes some of the work that we're doing is complex, but oftentimes, and I know I've heard both of you talk about this, where complexity isn't necessarily in the work; it's within the people that are doing the work.
Yeah, I think what Steve talked about here is really incredibly important and illustrates a variety of things and a way to move forward with this. First of all, is we have different perspectives, we have different goals, and there's obviously a lot of stuff there you'll never understand. People do crazy things. I mean, I don't know. I mean, my whole life, for a long time as a teenager and as a mid-adult, I was going after blondes, because when I was in kindergarten, there was this blonde I was enamored of. Now, who would know that? We get these impressions on us that make no sense whatsoever. So that kind of stuff is never going to be understood. By the way, my wife of 33 years is not a blonde. I got over that. I found somebody who really hit my heart, not just other things. But the point is, how do you do that? And there are two things that are required for this. He mentioned one, alignment. But to get alignment, I would suggest you need theory. And the reason for that is you need to say, Agile makes a big thing, and Scrum in particular talks a lot about empiricism, but I would suggest empiricism, obviously critical. Everybody has to use empiricism. It's not a question of is it good or bad, it's an essential piece, but it's not necessarily sufficient. To me, empiricism is a way you look at the past to see what happened, but theory lets you look forward to say, hey, if I try this, what might happen? And one of the famous quotes that's done a lot is George Box's, all models are wrong, some are useful. And we use that a lot to discount our models. But instead, what we should use it as, oh, my model is useful, but it's also wrong. How do I improve it? When Steve talks about the mental models, it's not like I have this mental model and it's all I work on. It's how am I continuously improving the mental model as I discover that it's wrong and can be more useful. And this is how you can bring perspectives together. It's why the product management and the vision and the strategy, are we going in the right direction? Because if we know we're going in the right direction, or we know what the right direction is actually what it is, you can get more alignment. You have to appeal to people's desire to work on something bigger than themselves. Now, some people don't have that, but if they don't, you're going to be in trouble anyway. So how do you get that alignment? And that's an important thing, is the theory. Now, I did get a question that I'm going to tie into this as well. So I'm kind of saying that as the background. But somebody asked how we're tying the DA Lean Scrum, or what we now call DA, Discipline Agile Scrum Master, Discipline Agile Senior Scrum Master. And a little ways back, I wrote something I called the New Scrum Game. And I asked the question, what would Scrum look like if, instead of coming from empirical process control and empiricism alone, we built it from Lean, which I think is a valid thought, and actually what was intended when Nonaka and Takeuchi wrote the new product development game. And that's then on the basis of theory. And how do you deal with the unknown? How do you deal with learning from people with different perspectives? Because if you don't have that, it's just a question of opinion. It's just a question of your perspective, and there's no way to look forward. So that's kind of what this whole thing, even though we talk about complexity, a lot of it has to do with how do people align and work together, and how do you expose that? One last thing, that example I gave where I said we broke every rule, about stable teams and things like that. The one thing that really made it work was getting a team that was the best team. Clearly, they outperformed everybody, and they were clearly the block of everybody. And when it became clear, so when we talk about blockers, it's not always laggards. These guys were the best team. And he encapsulated it all. He says, Al, if you're right, and I believe your theories are, then my team needs to slow down. And it took about a day to get him to say he'd slow down. But that was that understanding of bigger team, not my team, is essential in dealing with complexity, because then you get this united view, and you could be wrong, but you're learning together, not learning individually. So that's another key piece.
So we're pretty close to, the time always goes so quickly. I mean, these half-an-hour ones. And so before I just kind of start taking a look at what we'll be doing in our next webinar, I'd like to ask is, like, if you can give just one quick piece of guidance as far as where to maybe even begin looking at some of this, or where somebody might start. For you, Alan, for you, Steve, if you could just, kind of how best can you sum that up?
Well, I would actually read The Choice. Steve probably has the better, but it's a delightful book. And Dr. Goldratt really talks about critical thinking in The Choice. And I think that you will read that and be shifted in terms of what you should look for and how the universe works. And I'm not saying believe him, but in fact, I don't think you should believe anybody ever. I don't. I mean, there are people I know are better than I am, but I just listen to them as opportunities to learn, and then I have to figure it out myself. But I would say, how do you learn, and where do you limit yourself, and throw away any limitation you've put on yourself by learning, or somebody else that you think is very smart has put on yourself in what you can learn. Throw that away. I think even if they're right, it's not going to help you. It's going to hurt you. And most of the time they're wrong. So that'd be my number one thing.
All right. And Steve, how about for you?
Well, since Al mentioned The Choice of Dr. Goldratt, I cannot refrain from suggesting to reading The Goal, the first book of Dr. Goldratt. But I would suggest to read it 2 times. The first time, just read it as a story, and you will certainly pick up the essential elements of the theory of constraints, finding Herbie, the 5 focusing steps, and so on and so forth. By the way, also very interesting, just a reflection there. You probably know that in the book, he tells the story of the Boy Scouts going through the woods. And that's where he has the realization of what are the problems in his company. So he had to get out of the company, see something different, a mental model, that he then can relate to what was inside. Anyway, the first time you read through, observant of that fact, how the elements come together to identify the constraint and resolve it. But then read it once more and just examine the interactions between the people, how the relationships evolve during the storyline. So it's like, take another perspective. Don't care about how you optimize the factory floor or the flow of materials. Look at what the people are saying, how they are evolving their interactions. And there you can see how these people are like getting together. And then as a team, so to say, as a social body, a community, they resolve the problem. I think that's one of the most valuable lessons from The Goal, but you don't see it the first time you read it. You need to read it several times. I don't know how many times I read it, but I got it eventually. So start from The Goal or The Choice.
All right. One thing I do want to take just a moment to mention is the Campfire Talks with Herbie, Patterns of Success. Al and Steve are going to begin talking. That is on January 26th. And we can provide some information on that in the follow-up email that we send out to everyone as well. And what I'd like to do is let me share a little bit on what we are going to be talking about in our next webinar. So yes, if you would like any more information on this topic, any topics we've captured in the past, come see us at processmentors.com. We also have a community forum. Al's got a forum within this forum, all things discipline agile community, and it's just allthingsda.com. And for our upcoming webinar next week, I'll be rejoined with both Mark Lyons and Scott Ambler, and we're going to just have general DA discussions. So anything in advance, if you would like to have Scott or Mark talk on it, please send us an email. We'll work on getting them prepared to potentially talk on any topics you would like to hear about in the general DA space. Al, Steve, thanks again so much for joining us and the wonderful discussion, and good luck with your next upcoming talk together.
Thanks for having us, and those of you out there, thanks for being here.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure, Josh.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week.